Everyone to our first talk in our series, The Wilde Connection, which is jointly hosted by the British Association of Decadence Studies, BADS, and the Oscar Wilde Society. It's really great to see so many of you here, especially from all over the world. That's the great thing about Zoom. You know, so many attendees is excellent. I'm Dr. Jessica Gossling, and I'm treasurer and one of the co-founders of BADS, and I'm also a member of the Decadence Research Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London. So this talk is being hosted as a Zoom webinar, and I don't know if any of you have been in one of these before. It's definitely slightly new to us. So the way that that works is Darcy will talk for 40 minutes, and then there will be time, about 20 minutes for questions. As a member of the webinar, we can't see you, we can only see your names and your little logo. We also can't hear you, so you don't need to worry about that. But hopefully you can see and hear me and Darcy. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's some options. One of them is the chat, which you're all using really nicely now, and that's kind of quite informal, and everyone can see it. And the other thing that might be kind of new is the Q&A. So if you have any, yeah, Kirsten, my cat will come and be involved in a minute, I'm sure. So if you want to post any questions to Darcy, just put them in the question and answer, and then at the end, I will ask them to Darcy on your behalf. You can post in the chat or the Q&A at any point during the talk, and it won't interrupt anything or pop up or anything like that, so don't worry about that. Hopefully that covers everything, but Alice and I will be looking at the chat, so if you have any questions about that as we go along, just post them there and we'll answer them for you. Yeah, so let's get going with Darcy's talk. So I'm just going to introduce him very briefly. Darcy Sullivan, as probably lots of you know, is press officer for the Oscar Wilde Society. He's a regular contributor to the chat, and some of you might have already read, or I suggest you check out his new article on genre. It was really interesting. And he's also written extensively on comic books for the Comics Journal and other publications. He curates the Facebook page, the pictures of Dorian Gray, which I believe he's going to talk to you a little bit about in his talk. And he's just set up the Oscar Wilde Society YouTube page, which we encourage you to subscribe to. And in a few weeks, you'll be able to rewatch this talk there. So just to say that we'll be recording it, but we're only recording myself and Darcy, so nothing to worry about there either. Today, Darcy's talk is entitled Dorian Gray and the Comics. I'm going to pass it over to you, Darcy, now.
Thank you, Jess, and I'm going to start sharing now. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Jess, can you see it? You're muted, Jess.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, super, great. So I'm so glad to see so many people joining here to talk about Dorian Gray in comics. I think it's going to be an interesting talk. One of the main themes I'm going to explore in this talk is how the treatment of decadence and homosexuality, which are so key to Dorian Gray, how those change over time and how they change in the different cultural contexts in which comics were produced in the different countries that we're going to look at. I'm going to be talking about European and American comics here, not manga or Asian comics. It's going to be focused on America and Europe. And as is, I think, appropriate for a talk on decadence, you're going to see some beautiful things, you're going to see some ugly things, and you'll probably see at least one thing you'll wish you had never seen, okay? Now, let me start off by getting it straight on what we're talking about. We're not talking about panel cartoons, as you're familiar with from the New Yorker or other publications. This is one by the artist Gahan Wilson that I love. And we're not talking about that kind of thing. And here's another one from Gahan Wilson that I really love. Of course, in those conservative Victorian days, I kept it hidden way in the attic. No, we're going to be talking about comic books, or bande dessinée in France. And you might think, well, why is that? Why would Dorian Gray be covered in comic books? Comic books are for children, and they used to be for children, and now we know that there are comic books and graphic novels for all ages. But really putting a classic story like Dorian Gray into a comic setting is not that odd an idea. So comic books as such were really born, they were a product of the 1930s, and by 1941, you already had this line called classic comics, and classic comics was exactly what it said. They would take classic stories, usually sort of adventure stories. Robert Louis Stevenson got in there, and Three Musketeers was in there, but they would sometimes do darker stuff too. They did Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They did Frankenstein. So they did some things that were sort of in the weird fiction genre that you might put Dorian Gray in. And that started in 1941. Now, there was never a classic comic about Dorian Gray. And there may have been, it might have happened at some point, but something else happened first. And this is a little bit of context before we get to look at our first example of Dorian Gray in the comics. So, starting in the early 1950s, there was an even more relevant genre than classic comics relevant to Dorian Gray, and that was horror comics. So starting in the early 1950s, horror takes off as a genre in comic books. And these three examples were all published by the same company called EC. Formerly Educational Comics, it became Entertaining Comics. And EC Comics now is heralded as one of the classic comic book publishers of all time. And these comics in particular are held up as great examples. In fact, there's a brand new book this year from Taschen Books on the history of EC Comics. And also, despite how gruesome these comics look, they were actually very well written and very well drawn. But these were comics that little kids read. I mean, this is the early 1950s. And so they weren't decadent in the sense of they weren't about sex, they weren't about drugs or dissipation, but they were decadents of horror, right? Really looking at sort of an extreme sort of feeling of dread and feeling of horror. And you can see that the images could get pretty gruesome as well. Well, they caused some controversy because not only were these three EC comics published on a monthly basis, but there were dozens of imitators. So the market was overrun with horror comics, and the horror comics kept getting more and more extreme and trying to appeal for those little kid, dimes that they wanted to get, comics for 10 cents. And finally, this leads to some pretty horrific imagery. And it gets so bad that these comics are included in a book called Seduction of the Innocent, written by a psychiatrist who really laid into the whole comics field and said, basically, all of this is not only junk, it's leading to juvenile delinquency. And this led to Senate subcommittee hearings as they investigated the possible negative impact of comic books on little kids. They even called in the publisher of these comic books here. The publisher of EC was a guy named Bill Gaines. They called him in for testimony. It did not go well because they made him explain why he thought it was a good idea to have images like this. And this is probably the thing you're going to wish you hadn't seen. This is people at the end of one of the EC horror comic stories playing baseball with the parts of a human being, right? Using his head for the ball. It doesn't get worse than this in the presentation, folks, I promise. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is actually it was done by somebody who became one of the greatest cartoonists of the 20th century, Jack Davis, whose work would appear on things like Time magazine covers and posters for films. So anyway, there was a whole investigation of this. And the comics industry figured out that things were not going to go very well for them if they didn't do something. So they decided to self-regulate rather than have government come down and basically put them out of business. So they created the Comics Code Authority, which was adopted in 1954. And they said, we're going to put this sticker on all the comic books that are approved by the Comics Code Authority. So it's sort of like a rating system, movie rating system, but for comic books. And there are a bunch of things that you cannot do. You can't have scenes of horror or excessive bloodshed or gory or gruesome crimes. You can't have depravity or lust, illicit sex relations, sexual abnormalities, whatever that means, seduction, seduction, sex perversion, basically everything that you would find in decadent literature. You're not going to be able to have that in a comic book if you want to get this sticker on it. And if you don't get the sticker on it, guess what? They're going to turn you away at the liquor store and the drugstore and everywhere else the comic books were sold. So they basically regulated all the horror comics out of business by themselves. And so EC Comics, all the horror comics were gone, all their crime comics were gone. Don't feel too bad for them. They had one ace in the hole, Mad Magazine. So that basically kept them going and of course became super popular. Now you might think this was only an American thing, but actually England was importing a lot of these comic books from America, including the horror comics. And they were even getting plates and making their own versions of them because it was cheaper than actually taking all the comic books over from America. So the British government passed a rule called the Children and Young Persons Harmful Publications Act of 1955. You can see it's the exact same period. And this basically said you can't sell or distribute or produce horror comics or comics that are in any way offensive or anything that would be likely to fall into the hands of children or young persons and consist wholly or mainly of stories told in pictures and has a bunch of crimes or violence or cruelty or instance of. Basically, they did the exact same thing as America. We're going to make comics squeaky clean for kids, okay? Now, with that as backdrop, we do get to the first example of Dorian Gray in comic books, and it was a British example. It was from Thriller Comics Library in 1956. And Thriller Comics had a series of these, and they would often do classic novels and things like that, same as classic comics in the US. But they took some liberties. They took a few liberties because obviously they can't have Dorian Gray the way that the novel runs because it has all those things they're not supposed to have. It has horror, it has seduction, it has sexual abnormalities, whatever that means. All that kind of stuff is in there. So how are you going to do it without those things? They found a way. Now, they started off, I think, pretty well. It's actually very well drawn by Robert Forrest. He has a nice line to it, and it has a good Gothic sort of feel. And it starts off pretty much as the novel does. And there's Dorian seeing his painting and making the fateful wish. But it takes a left turn soon after that because, of course, in the novel, Dorian takes his friends to see Sybil Vane, the love of his life, and she performs terribly. Well, in this version, she actually does quite well. So this is Sybil Vane's one good performance, I guess, in the whole run of Dorian-oriented things. She does well, but Lord Henry says, I forbid you from marrying her because you don't have any money. You're relying on me for money, so I'll cut you off. You cannot marry her. Right? So what this does effectively is take the seduction part out of it. Dorian is not an evil seducer here. He is blackmailed, which is a good manly, macho, healthy, clean thing I think kids should know about blackmail. But that's obviously in a different camp from seduction. So he's blackmailed. He has to break it off with Sybil. And you think, okay, well, then maybe Sybil doesn't take the poison. She doesn't take the poison, which is great. Unfortunately, what does happen is she goes out in the street and gets run over by horses. So again, they take the suicide angle out. There's, suicide is decadent. They take that angle out. Now she's just run over by horses, which, is perfectly fine. And to make it worse, they take Dorian and in the novel, it's a little bit sort of obscure what exactly he's doing. There are a lot of charges laid at his door, but we know he's involved with drugs. We know that he's involved with seduction and bisexuality and maybe some kinds of sexual perversion. We don't really know. In this, they don't want any of that stuff going on in this comic book. So instead, they make him a Fagin-like crime master. So he's basically the godfather of, the Lower East Side in London. And here he is checking in on his gang. Well, what luck tonight, lads. And so they've cleaned it up. He's still bad, but now he's bad in a nice, macho British way. He's a crime lord. Also, they sort of exculpate him from the murder of Basil. So in this version, Basil and Dorian have a sword fight. which is what you see on the cover of the book. You might have been wondering why there was a sword fight in Dorian Gray. And during the fight, accidentally, Basil falls on top of Dorian's sword and gets killed. So it's an accidental death. Once again, it's like Dorian is made more innocent in a lot of ways in this. He doesn't murder Basil. He accidentally kills him during a sword fight. Now, towards the end, it almost feels like they're getting back on track. Dorian does not use the knife to stab the painting because the knife in this version doesn't exist. It's just the sword. He stabs the painting with the sword. But what happens next takes it back off track. Guess who comes in right then? Well, it's James Vane, of course. James Vane is still looking for Dorian. He does not get shot as he does in the picture of Dorian Gray. He is hunting Dorian till the very end. He comes in, and then there's this great line, but where is Prince Charming? Where is the fiend I have sworn to kill? So that's the end of it in this version. Still a moral lesson, I guess, in there about not being a crime lord. But what I love about this particular image is, unless I'm mistaken, James Vane actually has his foot up on the corpse. So go figure. Anyway, that was the first version of Dorian Gray in the comics. And you might think, given all the stuff I said about censorship and regulation and everything, that it would be a sort of a slow, creeping introduction of these elements, over the years that followed. Actually, that's not really what happened, because those enterprising Americans found a way to get around the comics code. And what they figured out was, it didn't apply to magazines. So if you had a comic book which was in color and a different size and on a spinner rack or whatever, that was for kids. But magazines were not typically for kids. So if you published horror comics, almost exactly the same as EC Comics, only in black and white, and you put them on the magazine rack, that was fine. You were not under any compunction to put a sticker on it. The Comics Code Authority, you didn't submit it to the Comics Code Authority, and you could just put it on the magazine rack like any other magazine. And this had worked really well for a publisher called Warren in the early 1960s, very successful, which led another publisher called Skywald to get into the market. And this wonderful cover, Scream #5, which I personally bought at the newsstand when it came out, 1974. So we're almost 20 years past that first example of Dorian Gray, and we get to this, and it is a delight. Now, in these magazines, they would have several stories, and usually the stories were sort of 6 to 8 pages long. So they don't have a lot of space or time to tell their story. This is the splash, and a couple things that you can immediately see about this. One is that it is quite wordy for a comic book. That is a lot of word balloons in this little space as they try to do some justice to a great work. But also the style of illustration is completely different. And this artist was one of a number of artists, Spanish artists primarily, who started working in the American market in the late 60s and early 1970s. And they brought a completely different style of illustration. They brought a very sort of illustration-oriented, as opposed to sort of comic book-oriented style to it. Again, everything was in black and white. That wasn't a stylistic choice. But you'll notice things like they don't have solid, boxes around all of the panels. There's some free floating between the panels, and it's very, it's a very graceful style of illustration. And in fact, if you look at some of the art, and that the page on the left there is actually from this, from this version, it has a lot in common with the sort of Art Nouveau revival art that was coming out in commercial markets in America and Britain at the time. And there's a couple of examples there that you can see some of the similarities. And what's really great about this version of Dorian Gray is, whereas they tried to avoid everything decadent and everything sort of sexual back in the 1956 version, it's only 1974, and bang, here we go. This is the first time that in comic books that you see Dorian Gray having a bisexual relationship, that sex enters the picture. That's Dorian lying on his back there smoking a cigarette, and a man and a woman who he's clearly just had sex with right next to him. And they talk about he was open in his debaucheries, he cared about no one and nothing. despite the very sort of critical narrative that you see there, it's not a debauched or evil looking image. It's actually very peaceful looking. These people look happy. You know, they look like they're in an ad for condoms or something. You know, this is a positive image. And I think that's really remarkable, given that you're still in a market that's primarily geared towards young people. Maybe not little kids, because it's a magazine, but young people. And I think it's a very positive illustration. And it's 1974, and you can see at the end here, they're very true at the end. The only thing that's different here, now, because they only have 8 pages, they did have to make changes. And one of the changes that they made was that Dorian kills himself right after he kills Basil. So as you look at this, that horrible person down on the left-hand side on the floor there, that's Dorian having transformed because he's killed his painting. And on the other side, that's Basil because he's just been murdered. So, okay, that was 1974. Now, we have a very long jump now to get to the next version of Dorian Gray in the comics. And it comes from a kind of a surprising place. So you have to go all the way to 2007 now. We're going more than 30 years. And when you get here, what's amazing is this is coming from Marvel Comics, which we all know today. Now, Marvel Comics had something that was like Classics Comics. This was an idea that would resurface many times in both America and Britain, this idea of covering classic works of literature. And so this was called Marvel Illustrated, and they did Dorian Gray. They did it in 6 issues, and then they put it together in a book. I'd love to say that this was a great version, but it just is not. It's very faithful, but it isn't very good. One of the things, first off, that's a tip-off is when Dorian meets Lord Henry, he's like that handshake. It's like, put her there, pal. It's like, that's such an American thing, isn't it? Like, you know, give me your hand there. Glad to meet you, buddy. Not decadent at all. And in fact, there is some decadence in there. Now, most of the decadent scenes that are illustrated come about when Dorian is reading the Yellow Book that we all know is really based on Au revoirs by J.K. Huysman. And so these illustrations, yeah, okay, they're getting into the decadence. There's no nipples, there's no pubic areas because it's still Marvel Comics, even though they're trying to go highbrow here. So they're not going to do that. But, you know, you do get a sense of debauchery. You get skulls and chains, which, you know, probably is not healthy for the people that are involved in all that. And obviously some kind of murder there. The reason I think this isn't very good, it sort of plods. They are telling the story very, very faithfully, but that's not always the best thing when you're doing an adaptation into another medium. And the artwork just doesn't make it. It is not elegant. It's not stylized. It doesn't evoke the richness of Wilde's dialogue or anything like that. It's okay. The artist obviously knows what he's doing, but it just doesn't, it's not exciting. And that picture on the right there, that's as bad as this portrait of Dorian gets. Now, usually when you see the portrait of Dorian Gray at the end, it's loathsome. It's supposed to be loathsome. This is not, this is just kind of, you know, ugly, not really loathsome. Now, fortunately, the very next year, they were working on it at the same time. 2 British guys, Ian Edginton and I.N.J. Culbard, came out with their own version for a label called Self-Made Hero. Now, Self-Made Hero also was doing a number of adaptations of classic works of literature. But these were passion projects. The people that worked on these were really into it. They weren't just hired to do a version of the picture of Dorian Gray. And what's great about this version, first of all, it again is very faithful. It's also very wordy. So a lot of the book is represented, a lot of the language is directly out of Oscar Wilde. It does mean that there are a lot of talking heads in this version. And fortunately, Culbard really knows what he's doing. He knows how to move panels around. He knows how to place what they call black spotting and things like that to move your eye around the page, and where to put the word balloons and things like that. I think he's a fantastic artist, very, very stylized, as you can see. And even though it's a little bit of a more cartoony style, I think it's an elegant style. And I think he really gets across some of the feeling of the book. one of the things they also do well in this version is that the Lord Henry really ages. And often when you see a film or even when you know, a graphic adaptation of Dorian Gray, Lord Henry doesn't really get that much older, even though all these years are supposed to have gone by with Dorian. So I love here the representation of Dorian. That's the, you know, and the fact that they've actually got volcano on fires. It's not just that he gets more evil; the actual setting gets more evil. You can also see the cat with the Egyptian symbol around its throat, which is sort of from the 1945 film version of Picture of Dorian Gray. And in fact, I think, you know, in comic terms, this is very similar to that film. There's a wonderful also silent page there, which covers a little bit of the ellipsis of which happens in the novel of we don't really know what Dorian was doing. Time passes and then something else happens, but you never really see all that evil that he was getting up to. So it's a lovely version of the story. And it was that same year followed by a French version, Le Portrait de Dorian Gray, by Stanislas Gros. Unfortunately, this one also does not really make it for me because the artist is just not up to the task. It's really more in the art, although we're going to see some huge variations in this story. His art is, first of all, I will like to say, there's some nice things about it. On the end papers, in the beginning, he's got the preface that Dorian wrote for Intentions for the Young. So he's got, you know, he's got some nice imagery there, and then he's got on the back end papers, he's got these, you know, related characters, some of which are directly related, obviously Beardsley and Huysman, but Greta Garbo, yeah, that's kind of a stretch. But there's a nice Beardsley-esque outline there and everything going on. But when you look at the art, even though he does get fairly decadent there, it's just, it's too crude. He really doesn't have the style to pull this off, in my opinion. It's a sort of a version of a Aline Claire style, which is what Hergé started with Tintin. It's a little bit like that, but just not that well done. You can see it gets fairly decadent, you know, and it, you know, it's French, so you can have sexuality and nudity and all those wonderful things. It maybe goes a little bit too far. I'm all for sort of visualizing what Dorian was getting up to. Human sacrifice seems like maybe it's just tipping over the edge there, because yeah, that's what you can see going on there on the right. Now, the other thing he does, the questionable artistic choice, is to actually bring in Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Why not, right? It's England, and every French person knows Sherlock Holmes and Watson live in England, so they come to investigate some of the weird things that are going on. And you know, Dorian, they're keeping an eye on Dorian. Again, not maybe a great move there. In fact, they are the people who find Dorian at the end of the story. Now, again, the artist does some nice things here. I particularly like the way that Dorian's dead face there, his head, is echoed just below by the reflection of the portrait. So there's some nice things here, but, you know, really Sherlock and Watson may be a bit too far. There are also some liberties he takes with events in the book. This is a scene that is in the novel towards the end where, you know, Lord Henry is talking about Basil, and he's talking about Dorian. Dorian said, well, what would you say if I said I was the one who killed Basil? And Lord Henry says, well, I would say you were, you know, studying for a part that doesn't fit you, you know, crime's too vulgar, you're not a vulgar person. That apparently was the wrong answer, because Dorian shoots Lord Henry, which of course does not actually happen in the novel. Lord Henry survives the novel. And that's, you know, that's taking a pretty big liberty with the book. But what comes next arguably is even worse. He shoots the mirror, okay, but then he sees the jeweled tortoise, which is borrowed here from Auribors and from apparently the real life of Robert de Montesquieu, and he shoots the tortoise. Now, fortunately, the bullet bounces off the jewels, but I think we can all agree you don't shoot the jeweled tortoise. Not a good idea. Now, I'm not crazy about this artist, as I said, but I do have to say he's just coming out now with another book called Les Dandes Illustrées. This is a page from it where Dorian, that's Dorian there in the green tie, is talking to a woman that I'm sure most of you will recognize as Black Cape Woman by Aubrey Beardsley. So sort of carrying on the Victorian decadence tradition, there he goes. Now, the next version is the version that I love, and I think most people who have read these different variations on Dorian Gray agree this is the masterpiece. And this is by a Spanish artist named Enrique Corominas. It was published in French. There is a Spanish version as well. And talk about decadence. So this is a painted comic, which, you know, those have been around for a while, but he does beautiful work. And the thing is decadent basically from the get-go and just beautiful to look at. So on the left there, you can see one of the scenes of Dorian at the beginning having his picture painted. The colors are beautiful. You get the green carnation, which is a nice nod to, you know, to what Oscar and his friends sometimes wore. In fact, it may be a little bit too decadent, because one of the things that he does is, rather than have Sybil Vane be sort of a mediocre Shakespearean actress, this is her on the right. That's Sybil Vane, you know, to coin a phrase, as you've never seen her before. This is sort of Sybil Vane, the cabaret artist, but it's not just cabaret, it's like some glorious, sexy show, which everybody loves, and you can kind of understand why. So quite a ways away from the Sybil Vane that we all grew up with. There are some wonderful images in this. So when Dorian starts reading that yellow book, Corominas illustrates it with some fantastic imagery. This is just one image, and I think this image, you know, it's not described in the caption. The caption is from the book, but what an image. I mean, so evocative, so evil, so decadent. So he's really getting into it here, and this is stuff obviously you're not really going to see in a Marvel comic book. There's a scene later on in the graphic novel by Corominas where Dorian, it's just before he stabs the painting, he sort of has this epiphany or out-of-body experience where he goes into this otherworldly dimension and is having these conversations with you know, sort of pygmy skeletons. And again, he changes style for this, which is a great thing to see in a comic book, you know, to change the mood. It's a very bizarre, surreal sequence. And I think also Corominas here, who's very into Wilde and knows his references, is also pulling on a couple of other cultural strings here. So one of them is, I think there's probably a reference here to the Orchidine Garden. The Orchidine Garden was basically the first magazine that appeared that was all about horror fiction or weird tales. It predates Weird Tales by a few years. It was started in 1919. And you know, it was itself sort of a late product of decadence and featured illustrations and stories. And I think there's sort of a nod there. There's also a nod, I think, to an American comic artist who was very inspired by symbolist art and Art Nouveau, and his name was P. Craig Russell. So I've done a little bit of a juxtaposition here. Now, P. Craig Russell did American comics like Doctor Strange, but he would be known to anybody who was in the graphic novel business and liked Oscar Wilde because he did several books of adaptations of Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. And he also did a number of opera adaptations, including Salome. So I think there's a little bit of a nod there. Now, you might be wondering, how decadent does this get? I mean, it just keeps going. There's, you know, some of the sexual parties that they're having. There's Dorian in the opium den down there. And the portraits themselves, when I said a few minutes ago about maybe it's even too decadent, one of the things is usually the picture of Dorian at the beginning is this sort of schoolboy, clean-faced, you know, butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. that's not this Dorian. The Dorian on the left, this is the first version of the painting here. There's already a sort of a sensuality here that's very decadent. You can see the green carnation, which in Oscar's time was kind of a symbol for homosexuality, as well as the matching green waistcoat. He's got a sort of a, come hither look on his face. He gets much worse, as the one on the right shows, and it's just a beautiful illustration of, sort of debauchery and madness with what looks like a dragon in the background as well. So, he really touches on all the decadent points. And he also takes the story in a couple of interesting other directions. At the end, when Dorian kills himself, that's not the end. In every other version of Dorian Gray, that is the end. In this version, what we cut to is a dinner party where somebody is telling the story of Dorian Gray, and that person is Lord Henry himself. So, suggestion of this is all metafiction. Also, a nice suggestion, I think, of continuity. Yes, that was Dorian's story, but life goes on, for these people, and they're all going to move into the 20th century, unlike Dorian. The artist Enrique Corominas also has done some explanations of some of the artistic choices that he took when making this. And if you're interested, I've put up there the blog where he explains some of this. And he's a really thoughtful artist, and also obviously his work is very beautiful. There is another version that follows. I'm not going to spend as much time on some of the other versions. Those were the sort of keystone publications. The Graphic Canon, which was a collection of different, illustrations of classical works. John Coulthart, who is a wonderful illustrator, he mainly does book covers and things like that. He's done some comics. He did Dorian Gray in 10 pages, and you might think, well, if he's got 10 pages, he's going to rush through it. Oh, no. What he does is he does a fantastic illustration, and then he just puts a little bit of text from the book, just a little passage. So it doesn't read as a story. It reads as sort of highlights, but it's mainly there to showcase these illustrations, which I think are really beautiful. You might be wondering, okay, well now you can put anything in a comic book, and there's certainly been homosexual comic books for quite a long time. Did anybody do a really, really gay version of Dorian Gray? Yes. Unfortunately, it's also not that good. It's called Dorian. It was done by Vernon Bauer based on an animated film that he'd done. It's just, again, it's an adaptation. It's not straightforward. He takes the story in very different directions. So it's modern day. It takes place in this sort of fashion world. It just doesn't really work that well. So, for example, here we see Dorian as a runway model. The art is sort of crude, and the language is very basic. You might think, okay, well, do they get into some sex in this? Yes, they do. They trekked back to Brooklyn, and they fucked a lot, and it was good. We're pretty long way from Oscar Wilde at this point. So we're getting the sort of decadence and everything, but I think a lot is being lost in the translation. I do like the picture that he does of the picture of Dorian Gray at the end, however. There's a very straightforward one from a few years ago. The Italians, by and large, most of their commercial comic books, even the very successful ones, a lot of them are very sort of prosaic in terms of the artwork, more so than you would get like with French artists. And so it's the artwork is nothing amazing. There's a nice bit of decadence there going on there in that one illustration, and it's a pretty straightforward illustration of the book. Again, not that interesting, although I like the nice Beardsley-esque panel decoration that he's got there. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other ways that Dorian has entered comics. So a few years ago in France, there was 2 volumes of The Return of Dorian Gray, where Dorian Gray basically didn't die, and he comes back for vengeance. It really has very little to do with the novel. He's shown up a couple of times in a long-running Italian comic called Martin Mystère. They had one that was called Operation Dorian Gray, but there was another issue much later where you see Oscar Wilde himself there with the Elephant Man. So they went full Victorian here. And at the bottom there, they're talking about La Storia di Dorian Gray, and you can see a little bit of the story there. There's an ebook called Dorian Gray where he's basically sort of a spy. It's not particularly close to the novel, obviously. Now, the one that people might think he was in was The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen was a comic book by Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill that brought together heroes or characters from a whole bunch of different Victorian fictional spaces and put them together as kind of the Victorian Avengers. And it was very well done. Alan Moore, obviously one of the great comic book writers of our time. The characters mainly there, Invisible Man, Nemo, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Alan Quatermain, and Mina Murray from Dracula. Not Dorian. However, if you look at that cover on the right-hand side, you can see the picture of Dorian Gray, and you can see it's actually signed Basil Hallward. So there was an allusion to it there. I think he might eventually have worked Dorian Gray into this comic. It ran for a number of years in a number of different series, except that they made a movie out of this. They made a movie of The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen with Stuart Townsend playing a very dashing-looking Dorian Gray. Alan Moore hated this film, and a lot of other people hated it. It's not a good film. And I think if he was ever going to include Dorian, he was not going to after they put him in this film. And so therefore, in a later series, when he needed a basically immortal character, bisexual, very pretty, who could be one of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, he did not pick Dorian Gray. Over on the right-hand side, that is Orlando from Virginia Woolf. That's who he chose. Now, I have withheld from you one, I'll get to that in just a minute. First, I just want to show, this is not over yet. This look at Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is still coming into comics. Next month, this is coming out, The Picture of Everything Else, which is based on actually Basil Hallward and things that he gets up to after the events of Dorian Gray. So, and it's interesting what this publisher says about it, about Vault Comics, where creators can break the established order and look at different conceptions of social identity. Inside the Vault, it's safe to be different. So they're obviously contextualizing what they're doing with Dorian Gray within this very progressive social context. Now, I have withheld from you one of the best versions of Dorian Gray ever in comics, and I'm going to share that with you now. It is in Masterpiece Comics in 2009. And the artist was R. Sikoryak, and he did the entire book. He did classic literature from a whole bunch of different authors, each one in the different style of a different kind of comic or a different comic book. With this, it's all very tongue-in-cheek and very ironic, and it's hilarious. You can see there the action heroes stampeding out of the newspaper background there, include Voltaire, Oscar Wilde, Shakespeare, Bronte, Dante. It's very, very funny. And the model that he took for Dorian Gray was one of the great comic strips of all time. It was by Winsor McCay. It's called Little Nemo in Slumberland. And Little Nemo in Slumberland ran in Hearst Papers full size. So it was an entire page in a tabloid newspaper would be this comic strip. And it was beautifully drawn. And usually what happened in this is it would start off sort of normal, but then things would start to get weird. So you can see in this, and this is only less than half of this particular strip this day, you can see that the garden is growing to an abnormal rate as Nemo walks around with his friend Flip, who shows up in a bunch of these. So what he did is take Little Nemo in Slumberland and make Little Dory in Pictureland, which tells the entire story of Dorian Gray in one long page. And it's beautifully done. You can see what he did there. And let me just show you a little bit more of this. If you see, the painting kind of stays in the same place throughout. It just gets worse and worse and worse. And, he's put in these tiny little dialogue boxes lines like, I love panel 17, I better blackmail a friend to help me remove the body. That's exactly what happens in the book. Just put it in like one little word balloon. The other thing that's great about this is every episode of Little Nemo in Slumberland ended the same way. It always ended with Nemo in bed, having just woken up from this wild dream that he's had, and usually his parents are yelling at him from another room. And so he takes that and he does that with it. So yes, mom's yelling at him, but this little Dory is not going to get up. So that's the look that we're going to have at various versions. Almost all of these are easy to buy. If you're interested, you can go to Amazon or eBay and probably find them. The one from 1956, that first one, the British one, you can't, but it has just been published in a book called Clash of Blades that you can get at bookpalace.com, British publisher, and they put a whole bunch of these together. The Scream also, you can't get that. However, it is included in a book that you can get on Amazon, Skywald Scream Volume 2 from the oddly named publisher down there. So you can find it if you want to. It's in Volume 2 of Scream, and you can get that on Amazon. If you're really interested in Dorian Gray, or if my talk has made you really interested in Dorian Gray, I do encourage you to check out my Facebook page, The Pictures of Dorian Gray. It's at Pics of Dorian Gray, and it started with 100 covers of the book talking about the different styles and everything, and now it's just a whole bunch of stuff related to Dorian Gray. I also encourage you, if you're not already a member of the Oscar Wilde Society, to join us. It's a fantastic group. We usually have a lot of events. Obviously, we're not doing those right now, other than this one with the BADS team, which I'm really excited about. And we also publish some fantastic publications. So even when you can't go to our events, the publications alone are well worth whatever you're going to pay in terms of membership fees. The Wilding is just a fantastic journal, and we have a couple of other publications as well. We also have a new YouTube channel, which I encourage you to check out. And finally, I'd just like to leave you by plugging the next talk in this Wild Connection series with the Oscar Wilde Society and BADS, which is my friend Eleanor's presentation next week at this same bat time, same bat channel. And she's going to be talking about Wild Stoker Dracula. And I am really looking forward to hearing her talk about that. And with that, let's open it up to any questions.